Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. This is Navigating on Disability, Technology, and Experiencing the World. My name is Liz Bowen. I am the Rice Family Postdoctoral Fellow at the Hastings Center and the moderator for this event. Just a few things before we get started. Access note, we do have ASL and captioning provided. In a few moments, I will paste a link into the chat for a full live transcript. If you want to type that into the URL into your browser yourself, it's www.thehastingscenter.org/captioning. We will be recording this event. It'll be available shortly after the event ends on the Hastings Center's website. And although as audience members, you are not able to be audible or visible, you can enter questions into the Q&A function of Zoom at any time. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the event and offering up some of those questions to the speakers in the second half of the proceedings today. But again, you can submit questions to the Q&A at any time and we will be watching those. Without further ado, I will get off of your screens and introduce my colleague, Eric Perrins, who is the Director of Bioethics and Humanities at the Hastings Center. Take it away, Eric.
Thanks very much, Liz, for all of your contributions to making this event happening. And thanks to all of you for joining this second in our series of 6 events funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. The purpose of our series is to broadcast and to explore one fundamental theme, which is that people can flourish in all sorts of bodies. To flourish, on our understanding, means to exercise the capacities we were born with in pursuit of the goals that we find meaningful. None of us needs a different body to flourish. We need different, more supportive environments. I should say that no one has articulated our theme more powerfully than Rosemary, Garland, Thompson, who is a co-organizer of this event, a senior advisor to the Hastings Center, and as many of you know, a pioneering disability studies scholar. I should also mention that we at the Hastings Center view this series as an important part of our 50th anniversary celebration. Because the term bioethics has many connotations, I want to say something about what it has meant here at the Hastings Center. So since its inception, many of us at Hastings have thought critically about the meaning of very familiar medical technologies, like, for example, those monitors that are above patients' hospital beds. The concern is that in drawing doctors' attention to a single feature of how a patient's body is functioning, such technologies can take doctors' attention away from the patient as a whole person. And bioethicists at Hastings have been concerned that reproductive technologies, like prenatal genetic testing, are being used to ensure that only people with certain sorts of bodies will be welcomed into the human community. And we've been concerned that medical professionals sometimes foist onto people with atypical bodies some very old-fashioned technologies, like leg braces, with a view to fixing those people who don't need any fixing at all. So we at Hastings have often emphasized that such technologies have been integral parts of systems that can thwart the flourishing of many people, in particular disabled people. In developing that line of critique, we have not always given equal attention to the myriad ways that people in general and people with disabilities in particular use technologies to promote their flourishing. So when we conceived this series, we said we wanted to explore the simple fact that technologies can be used to thwart and to promote flourishing. We were trying to use the term technology as a hook for getting at our fundamental theme, that people can flourish in all sorts of bodies. Now, frankly, today, it's not crystal clear to me that the term technology is all that great a hook for getting at our theme. But a beautiful thing about being in conversation, as we are today, is that we have an option of revising our thinking. Indeed, the question about the usefulness of the term technology might come up today in the panel discussion that Rosemary, Garland, Thompson will moderate with our speakers, or it might come up in the conversation between all of you in the audience and our speakers that Joel Michael Reynolds will moderate. Joel was the inaugural Rice Family Postdoctoral Fellow at the Hastings Center, and he is the co-director of this series. He's also a philosopher, bioethicist, and disability scholar who is now at Georgetown. The term activity is another hook we have used to get at our fundamental theme. Each of our 6 events is linked to an activity that can be crucial for functioning, for flourishing. And each of our wonderful speakers today will consider the activity of navigating. Our first speaker is Yomi S. Rong. Yomi is a healthcare professional, a freelance journalist, and disability justice activist who will explain the fundamental importance of being able to choose a technology that fits with one's sense of oneself and allows one to navigate the world freely. Before I turn it over to Yomi, please remember that if you would like to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function. Now it's my very great pleasure to turn the screen over to our first speaker, Yomi. Yomi Rong, over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and hi, everyone. I'm Yomi Rong, joining from the land of smoke and fire, otherwise known as Northern California. I'm an African-American woman with dark, curly, shoulder-length hair and glasses. I'm a little person. I'm sitting in a power wheelchair with a bookcase behind me. I'm excited to be here and appreciate the Hastings Center for inviting me into this conversation on navigating. The story I chose for today is very tender to me. I've not spoken about it much and feel nervous to share it, but here goes. I was my best self at 9 years old. Happy, witty, and confident, I truly liked who I was. I'd hit a stride in the 4th grade. I was mastering long division, reading and writing above 8th grade level, had beautiful penmanship, and performing at the top of my class. Adding to my confidence, I was cute and popular. There is a picture of me on the bookshelf over my left shoulder that's me at 9 years old in the 4th grade. The picture is black and white. I have pigtails and bangs. I'm smiling with my eyes and my mouth, and I'm wearing a velour shirt because this was, I don't know, 1981 or so, and that was the fashion. So at that age, kids gravitated to me. I was outgoing and a natural leader who tried to always make others feel included. At school, I was often paired with shy kids, my task being to help draw them out. Or I was paired as a study buddy with somebody needing extra help in a subject that I excelled. This latter gift is how I first came to straddle two different realities at my elementary school. And this led to an unfortunate incident that would shape so much of my disability identity. My fourth grade teacher thought I needed more intellectual rigor and arranged for me to quasi-mainstream into a sixth grade science and math class. Mainstreaming, if you're unfamiliar with the term, is the process of transitioning disabled kids from segregated educational settings into public schools with able-bodied kids. Now, I very much liked my school, my classmates, and especially my teacher. But to be honest, the experience of being bused 20 minutes away, while my friends on the block got to walk together to the neighborhood elementary school, built up in me a longing. I wanted to be with them. Going to a different school excluded me from a huge part of their world, and the divide was becoming harder to overlook. For instance, when they laughed about the antics in Mrs. So-and-so's homeroom, I couldn't follow the joke. After school, when a gaggle of kids charged into the corner bodega for ice cream or candy, or to the local pizzeria to play video games, I was never included because I wasn't with them. I knew nothing of the games they invented at recess. I knew nothing of team sports or how to navigate a cafeteria. I'm sorry, what exactly happens in a lunchroom? You see, in my special education school, we took our meals in the classroom. Except for physical therapy or trips to the bathroom, we rarely left our classroom or each other. I guess we were too precious for recess, too fragile to jockey in hallways, too fussed over to rip and run after school. Being in special education for me meant being segregated, virtually invisible to anyone outside our walls. So this chance my teacher was giving me to leave my cloistered environment and dwell in the rarefied space of able-bodied children felt like a golden ticket. The school I attended was on the first floor of a multi-story building. The upper floors was occupied by a public elementary school for hundreds of kids that we never interacted with. So each week, I left my campus on the first floor and rode an elevator up to the public school. And of course, I was quite the freak at first. Kids gawked and giggled, but over time, we all got used to me being in the space. Soon, I was paired with a boy who needed support with math, and we became great friends. I don't remember his name, but I remember his kindness and his smile. I remember the happiness I felt when the elevator doors would open and he would be waiting there to escort me to class. We had so much fun together. A few months into the school year, this perfect boy asked if I wanted to go to a movie over school break. Calm down, this was not a date. We were 9 years old. But it was a very big deal. Meeting up for activities outside of school was a social and developmental milestone I was missing out on. Now, some of the details of the movie caper are fuzzy, but here's what I remember. It was somehow worked out that his big brother and my big sister would escort us to a matinee. And I feel like these teenagers must have hijacked the encounter because they each ended up inviting an extra friend, but whatever. Movie day arrived, and my mom left money for tickets, snacks, and cab fare. This last detail is critical. You see, had we taken the bus, I wouldn't have been able to go to the movies in my wheelchair. My wheelchair was clunky and rigid and impossible to haul onto a bus or subway. This was 1981 in the Bronx, New York, a full decade before the Americans with Disabilities Act made public transportation accessible. But with cab fare, there was no reason to leave my chair behind. With a little muscle, the chair could be folded up and transported in the trunk of the car. For reasons still mysterious to me, someone made the executive decision not to take my wheelchair. It was decided that I would go to the movies in a stroller. Now would be a good time to mention that for most of my early childhood, I had two modes of mobility. The wheelchair, which I used primarily at school and around my neighborhood, and a lightweight, toddler-sized stroller. Navigating New York City and really anywhere as a pedestrian was much easier to do with me in a stroller. Unlike with my wheelchair, one person could pick me up and collapse the stroller in seconds. We could run up subway steps or get on a bus or even hail a cab very quickly. The stroller weighed next to nothing. In the New York of my childhood, a toddler stroller was the most convenient piece of adaptive technology because it allowed for greater access and movement around the city. But the stroller also changed how I showed up in the world. Tucked down low to the ground as I was in a stroller, everything about me became obscured. My age, what grade I was in, even the fact of my physical disability. Unless I opened my mouth to speak, strangers could easily take me for a toddler or a little kid of maybe 3 to 5 years old. Let me just say this worked brilliantly at amusement parks that let toddlers and little kids in for free. But I don't think this was the motivating factor for the person taking me to the movies that day. It was the carrying me down the stairs to the cab, the breaking my wheelchair apart, the folding it up, the putting it together at the movie theater, and then repeating the whole rigmarole for the return trip home. I acknowledge this was a hassle. Now again, I've blocked out some details of what occurred next, and no one in my family remembers it quite this way. But it didn't happen to them. Emotion imprints memory, and here's the way I experienced it. Someone said, "We're just going to take your stroller, okay?" No. I will not go to the movies in a baby stroller. But you've done it before. That was before. This is today. Different stakes. I threw an epic fit. My mother was called at work to mediate. I wanted her to force these people to bring my bloody wheelchair. But someone said, "If he's really your friend, Yomi, it won't matter how you show up." They were right, technically, and I had no counter-argument. Again, I was 9 and having a tantrum. I do remember not wanting to go anymore, but being forced to anyway. I remember feeling so sick in the cab. I remember hot tears running down my face. I remember praying we would crash. Dramatic, I know. But for me, seeing a school friend out in the real world for the very first time was a big deal. Must we make it awkward? I feared my friend's reaction to seeing his smart, capable school chum stripped of mobility and independence, infantilized, seeing me so out of context. Would it be too much? Indeed it was. I recall this next sequence in slow motion. That sweet boy dancing nervously in front of the ticket booth, then rushing to greet the cab when we pulled up to the curb. My sister emerges, pretty and smiling. She whips out the stroller. My friend looks confused. Then she lifts me from the back seat, plops me into the stroller, and straps me in. My friend looks horrified. The older boys with him look befuddled, unsure who has shown up. Certainly not the vibrant girl he's been talking about. The moment turns rancid with my mortification. My sister, ever my champion and my shield, breaks the spell by striding confidently to the ticket counter. She did her best to lighten the air. But my friend looked away, and I did too. We did not talk the rest of the day. Back at school, things shifted. We stopped studying together. We stopped looking at each other. We stopped being friends. Like I said earlier, I've hardly spoken of this to anyone, but it has stayed with me, and I've spent 40 some years trying to get over it, to make sense of it. My wheelchair, more than any piece of assistive technology, is the thing I will fight for. Because there are real and unforgiving consequences for disabled folks when we are denied equipment of our own choosing. The wrong technology can cause physical pain or secondary impairments or deep emotional scars. When I choose for myself, I source technology that is as much about maximizing my function as about making the right statement of who I am. My chair is how I first get read when I show up in any space. I fill in the rest, of course, but my chair gives much important information at the start. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're going to pause for just a moment. Two things. First, our ASL interpreters need to switch. And second, we know there have been some problems with the closed captioning. We've been trying to figure out what the source of the problem is, and so far have not had any luck. I will reiterate for the time being, there is a link to the full transcript in the chat, but we understand that's not adequate for everyone here, and so we're doing our very best to resolve the problem with the closed captioning. I think it may be an issue with the Zoom webinar format, because it seems like it's the toggle closed caption option is not showing up for people. But we're really not sure what's going on with that. And if anybody has any wisdom to what the problem might be, we would very much appreciate you letting us know. Okay, I'm gonna let the interpreters switch now. Thank you.
And while our interpreters are switching, I will thank Yomi for such a wonderful talk and introduce Rod Michalko. Rod is a sociologist, memoirist, and disability studies theorist who lives in Toronto and teaches at the University of Toronto. As soon as Liz says we're ready, Rod, it's over to you.
Okay, apparently the closed captioning has just showed up for most people now, thank goodness. And again, we really apologize for that lapse in accessibility here. Thank you for bearing with us, for all your patience, and take it away, Rod.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say just a correction on the introduction from Eric, although thanks for that. I'm mostly retired from the University of Toronto right now. That's number one. Number two is it's Yomi, that was a beautiful talk, and I'm gonna have to remind myself never to follow her again in the future. That's a tough act to follow. At any rate, I'm a blind white guy, and I'm I think about average build. I'm not too sure about that. I think I have long, kind of wavy hair, and I'm wearing dark glasses, which I think are blue, and hopefully matches my purple t-shirt. If not, I'm going to blame my partner, Tanya, for that. In case it doesn't match. I'm just kidding about that. I'm sitting at home, and I think there's a bookcase behind me. How I'm going to do my talk is with a piece of technology that's so dated that I'm sure many of you don't even know the term. It's called a dictaphone. And on this dictaphone is a tape of what I'm about to say. And I'm going to just repeat it with this ear thing in, okay? So I'm going to start that, and please indulge me for any time I mess up. Thank you. And by the way, sorry, welcome everybody, and I'm glad that you're all here. All right, here we go. The freedom of movement is something that many people take for granted. Some have the freedom to move from one country to another, from one region to another. Some move freely between careers and jobs. And many have the freedom of bodily movement, the freedom to sit, to stand, to walk, and to run, the freedom to move freely in a city such as New York or Toronto, where I am from, the freedom to negotiate a flight of stairs, escalators, elevators, the freedom to drive cars, take public transit, and the freedom to negotiate the rest of the environment, built especially for those who take the freedom of movement for granted. There are some, however, perhaps even many, whose freedom of movement is restricted beyond any typical limitation, and for whom free movement is not taken for granted. I am speaking here of disabled people. We negotiate an environment, one that is not built for us, and we do so daily. I want to talk about the unique world my blindness gives me, and how my guide dog Smokey and I moved freely with my blindness in this world. First thing I want to say about this blind gig is that while it does impose some limits on my freedom to move, it is sight and the way it organizes the environment that hits my freedom to move and hits it hard. The material and the virtual worlds are built by and for those who see. This is the world I negotiate and have negotiated all of my blind life. Movement in the world, free or not, is almost always accompanied by technology. Whether walking with the technology of footwear, traveling in airplanes or trains, whether moving in wheelchairs with white canes or with guide dogs, whether negotiating in the virtual world with nimble fingers on a keyboard and quick eyes on a screen, or with software that imitates such movements, poorly as they do, in whatever way we move with technology by our side. For many years, I moved with, literally by my side, my guide dog Smokey. He didn't so much move me through the world as he moved me in the world, and in blindness as he accompanied me in my movement. Although he did guide me through the world, I experienced it more as a liberation, as free to move. This was my experience with Smokey in the beginning of our life together. Soon, though, I began to realize that it wasn't only that Smokey accompanied me, we accompanied one another. Blind man and dog moving together, negotiating a world, not strictly ours. The world in which Smokey and I moved was the sighted world, one where people looked and saw. It was a human world, one where people moved so freely on two legs, and in a world they typically experienced from a point much higher than the place from which Smokey viewed the world. It was the sighted world, a human world. There were blind people and dogs in that world, of course, but it wasn't the blind world, nor a dog world. And it was in this world that Smokey and I moved. We were not completely strangers to the world, however. We had experience with the world, estranged as we were from it. Smokey was a dog, an animal. At the same time, though, he was a guide dog, a highly trained and intelligent service animal. Moreover, like other dogs in our culture, Smokey was domesticated. The world of humans was his home, even though Smokey himself wasn't human. But with his high level of training, he was not only accepted in the world of humans, he was understood as a useful and valuable member of that world. He assisted me, a blind person, in navigating a world fashioned for and by sight. I, in contrast, am human, and not in the way Smokey was, an animal. Yet there was something unnatural about my humanness. It is natural for humans to see, I don't. And therein lies my unnatural human status. Whereas Smokey represents domesticated nature, I represent the unnatural nature of the human with eyes gone wrong. The estranged familiarity that Smokey and I were was the fertile ground for experiencing the world stripped of its taken for granted character. Our life together presented us with the unusual opportunity to see some of the ways our world is put together, ways that are as invisible as sight itself. Smokey not only showed me ways of negotiating the world, he gave me a glimpse of that world from an entirely different viewpoint, a viewpoint that revealed some of the invisible features of the sighted world. The most crucial thing Smokey gave me was a farther reach into the world. He also firmed up my contact with it, a contact that permitted farther reach. Until then, I had 3 points of contact: my 2 feet and the artificial contact of my white cane. Smokey gave me 6, my 2 feet and his 4 paws, none of which were artificial. My reach into the world was now extended by the length of his body, by the speed and the assured grace of his movement. I didn't so much follow Smokey as I moved with him through the world, negotiating it with a habitual rhythm that came eerily close to moving confidently and with, most surprisingly, joy. There were, of course, many close calls Smokey and I had as we moved, such as the time when he suddenly cut across my body and shoved me out of the way of a speeding car running a red light. There were also many fun times, such as the time we visited a summer fair in rural Nova Scotia. He loved animals, and walking through one of the barns housing farm animals proved to be Smokey's favorite time. It wasn't easy to encourage him out of there, and when I was finally successful, we continued our tour of the fairgrounds. Smokey's intricate movements around the unfamiliar grounds soon were too much for me, and I allowed Smokey to show me the fairgrounds in the way that he chose. I got caught up in Smokey's flow, clearly his intention, since in a few minutes we were back at the barn. Smokey did free my blindness into the world, even in the midst of the not so freeing stereotypes and often bizarre representations of blindness and of guide dog teams our culture offered as we moved. But as Smokey and I moved in this strange and familiar world, he released yet another freedom. The freedom to belong in that world and to belong on our terms. Smokey did help me negotiate this world, but he made it clear that the world we were moving in and through was our world. We belonged there, and we belonged as blind and sighted, moving and living together as human and animal, forming the basis of this estranged yet familiar movement and life. My left hand on Smokey's harness and a simple forward Smokey, we entered the places and spaces, the sounds, the touches, and the smells that were our world. A world we released into that world. We were one of those places and spaces, one of those sounds, touches, and smells. We were not, though, merely one more of them, seen with the banal gaze of difference. Instead, we were distinct. We were the sight of blindness, not as the banality of difference, but as the richness of distinction. And never before had I moved through the world where sight did not have the right of way. Forward, Smokey. And then movement, speed, grace. The world opened before us, and Smokey and I, our world, elegantly entered it. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I thought, Liz, you were going to give a chance to switch interpreters, but no, I believe we're going to turn it over to Kim. Rod, thank you for so much for another just spectacular talk. Kim Q. Hall, our third speaker, is a philosophy professor and scholar of gender, women's, and sexuality studies at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and she is currently teaching there full-time. Rod, I'm sorry for that mistake earlier. Over to you, Kim.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks everyone for being here. And just thanks again, Yomi and Rod, for wonderful talks. My walk has always been a problem. Or should I say my walk has always made me a problem. I was born with what in my life has often been referred to as a malformed hip joint. More specifically, I was born with a shortened acetabulum, which meant that my hip socket did not completely curl around my femoral head on my left side. It was a case, one might say, of arrested hip development. Not enough hip, not hip enough. My so-called birth defect was diagnosed during a routine pediatric exam meant to check for such anomalies. When the pediatrician bent my knees toward my chest and then rolled them outward, he heard the telltale sound of my left femur popping out of joint. And when my mother changed my diapers, my left leg would fly off in an awkward angle. I have no memory of what my hip popping out of joint felt like. However, I do have memories of treatment, of being wheeled into surgery, being casted and braced, having my cast changed when I outgrew it, regular follow-up appointments with the orthopedic surgeon, and the dreaded trip to the shoe store, where I was never permitted to get the shoes I wanted for orthopedic and gendered reasons. I was nearly 2 when I had surgery on my left hip. This was followed by 3 months in a body cast, coupled with a brace that consisted of a metal bar between 2 shoes that kept my feet fixed in position pointing outward. All of this meant that my walking was delayed. One of my uncles attached 4 wheels to a piece of plywood so that I could roll around the house. My earliest ambulation in the world was head first on my stomach. My mom says I was hard to catch. By 1st grade, I was no longer braced at night, but I still had to go to the orthopedic clinic where I would be x-rayed and where I was required to walk up and down the hallway under the diagnostic gaze of the orthopedist and my mother. The result? The orthopedic conclusion is that I was fixed, cured, if you will. The result from my perspective, I walk, but with a difference. In my remarks today, I want to reflect on why and how this difference matters. My focus isn't on whether or not technological intervention is good or bad. Technology can be informed by an ableist commitment to disability elimination, and it can be used in creative, resistant ways for disability flourishing. But the effects of technology can also exceed these aims, creating zones of embodied being in the world at the edges of ability and disability. Within ableist contexts, one is either abled or disabled, and technological intervention, like surgery, moves one from abnormal to normal, from disability to ability. How might we understand navigation at the edges of these categories? In an effort to think about some of the issues raised by this question, I focus on 2 points. First, how my gait troubles ableist assumptions about the distinction between ability and disability. And second, how we might think about flourishing between ability and disability. First, gait. I have what many characterize as a limp, though it is a limp that also embodies a swagger. I have walked under the diagnostic gaze of doctors, and I have been periodically chastised for walking like my father and like a truck driver. These accusations signal that my gait defies both abled and gendered expectations. I have a limping swagger or a swaggering limp. Either way, my gait exceeds the bounds of the normal. From an ableist perspective, the surgery, bracing, etc., were successful because they fixed an impairment that would have prevented walking. That said, from a perspective that I call queer and crip, these technological interventions did not completely erase my body's difference. My gait bears the trace of disability experience, situating me between ability and disability in ways that call into question ordinary assumptions about both categories and their relationship. In an ableist society, the aim of curative technologies is disability elimination. The orthopedic technological interventions I experienced aim to normalize my body by making it possible for me to navigate the world by walking. Still, my limping, swaggering gait violates gendered, heteronormative, and ableist expectations of how a body like mine is supposed to move through the world. While my gait might not count within narrow legal and medicalized understandings of disability, it is shaped by disability experience. Walking does not make me anonymous for reasons to do with gender and disability. It is not uncommon for me to encounter a stranger's stare that first goes to my foot and leg and then takes in the rest of me. Sometimes the starer just stares. In limping, swaggering along, I confess that it's difficult, if not impossible, for me to know whether the stare is initially directed at my limp or my gender nonconforming swagger. but both converge to shape how I navigate the world between ability and disability. Second, flourishing between disability and ability. I use the phrase queer crip to describe this way of navigating the world, drawing on Nancy Meyers's explanation of why she prefers to identify as cripple rather than disabled. She writes, quote, "As a cripple, I swagger," end quote. Like the word queer, cripple has a history of being weaponized against stigmatized groups singled out by the term. And like queer, crip, a shortened form of cripple, has been reclaimed by many to describe experiences that aren't typically associated with disability, and to name a politics of proud, spectacular defiance of pressures to assimilate to exclusionary norms. Queer and crip call for a more expansive understanding of gender, sexuality, ability, and disability, attuned to experiences that defy conventional assumptions about who is included in or excluded from a category, like disability. An experience of being disabled at birth and then subjected to medical interventions aimed at normalizing the body by erasing disability is not what most people have in mind when they think of disability experience. Within conventional understandings of disability, my experience might be categorized as an experience of cure. Nonetheless, in limping, one stands out, and one's navigation is often interrupted by questions like, what's wrong? What happened? What did you do to yourself? Such questions communicate that one doesn't belong. To limp is to fail to meet expectations of fluid motion, a monstrous occupation of space. When one has been categorized as cured, a limping gait defies expectations of how abled normal bodies move. But you had surgery and you were able to play sports. Why are you limping? To swagger is also to defiantly move through space. A swagger is an embodied assertion of self that is unconcerned with what others might think. When it's part of one's gender nonconforming embodied being in the world, a swagger flouts gendered expectations, asserting and affirming one's presence in a world predicated on one's shame, misery, or non-existence. And so, in characterizing my gait as queer crip navigation, I aim to reframe disability and ability beyond the framework of diagnosis and cure, and to understand how heteronormativity, ableism, and other forms of oppression work together to normalize body-minds. As queer crips know in our bones and joints, orientations toward the normal won't cure what ails us or create possibilities for flourishing. Following the concept of deaf gain in deaf studies, the term disability gain has been used to describe disability as a source of knowledge about and creative being in the world. Disability gain defies ableist assumptions of a disability as a lack of ability, or of disabled people as objects rather than subjects of knowledge. Perhaps what I'm thinking about here might be called crip gain, a perspective situated between disability and ability that troubles the boundaries of both. What can be gained from understanding experiences of childhood medical interventions, not as eliminating or curing disability, but instead as situating one between ability and disability in ways that don't make one disabled in a legal or medical sense, but nonetheless position one as queer crip. I suggest that such queer crip navigations offer a perspective on how various forms of oppression work together to impede or enable navigation in the world and forge paths of aspirational solidarity with others who, for various reasons, are denied free movement in the world. Rather than aim for a fixed destination, queer crypt navigations open possibilities for flourishing at the edges of normalizing conceptions of identity and belonging, thus suggesting another way to be.
Thanks so much, Kim. We are going to pause now for another interpreter switch. And just before we do that, I just want to thank all of the attendees again for your coaching us through our captioning difficulties, and thank you for your patience. It seems to be working now, but if you have any more problems accessing the captioning, please do let us know and we'll do our best to troubleshoot. It seems like it was some kind of Zoom related issue. But yes, thank you for bearing with us as we learn how to use this webinar format. Okay, now we'll take a moment to switch.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Just a second, Eric, we haven't quite finished switching yet. Okay, we should be good now.
Thank you so much, Kim, for a terrific talk. Thank you so much, Liz, for shouldering these logistical matters so well. It's time now to begin the conversation among the speakers. Rosemary, Garland, Thompson will moderate that, and I want to assure everyone that we will be getting soon to an opportunity for you in the audience to put questions to the speakers. Over to you, Rosemary.
Good afternoon. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you very much to everyone who contributed to this really terrific event. The NEH, the Hastings Center, Joel, Eric, Liz, the support team, but most of all, my fellow panelists, my colleagues, my friends, my fellow travelers who have spoken. I'm joining you today from my home office in San Francisco, and I wanted to tell you a little bit more about who I am. I'm a senior woman educator with silver hair that's a lot longer than it used to be, and pale skin that's a lot paler than usual. The technologies that I'm using here today are my glasses and the machines and the applications that I need to use to be with you here today and to participate, because I don't type. So I have 3 questions that I want to present to our team of speakers. And these questions recapitulate or recap in some ways what the speakers have thematized in their work and what they've said. So I'll begin with question 1. We'll take a few minutes for the speakers to respond. If you don't get a chance, our speakers, to answer or to respond to all of my 3 questions as fully as you'd like, I think there'll be ample opportunity for us during the question and answer period from the attendees. And I do want to also say thank you very much to our audience for being here today with us. So, question 1. Each of you has offered us a story about an event that shaped your disability identity. Those are the words that Yomi Rong uses in talking about our stories. Each of your stories shows the ways that you get around in the world, our technology, and how we use that technology, and how that technology, and I'm quoting Yomi again here, makes a statement of who we are. Technology such as wheelchairs, guide dogs, braces, or canes are often understood as aids that compensate for what we can't do or for some inadequacy the world seems to think we have. Your stories today show us how we use our technology very intentionally to live in a world not built for us, as Rod tells us. We use technology to move from a segregated world that excludes people with disabilities to one where we can access opportunities such as education, employment, economic security, housing, to enter into a world where we have what Rod calls freedom of movement. I'd like to ask the three panelists to give us a few more examples of how you intentionally use the technology that you need to access the kinds of resources that enable you to flourish as people with disabilities, rather than people who are trying to become non-disabled. Ready?
Sure. The last part of your question about flourishing and being present as a person with a disability versus trying to not be disabled, I would say that right around maybe a few years after that period of the story that I told, I kind of stopped going or participating in physical therapy. I stopped trying to use crutches and walkers. I was using those to both gain strength and mobility. It seemed important to people and to the medical community and to my family that I walk, that I learn to walk. But the truth is, my disability, which is osteogenesis imperfecta, I have brittle bones and I'm a very small person. And it actually was quite unsafe for me to be walking, to go to school with the walker or crutches, because I broke so easily. I could be walking or trying to exercise or riding a tricycle. I could be doing nothing. I could sneeze and break a bone. So in fact, my wheelchair became protective. And I use my wheelchair as sort of an exoskeleton to sort of move through the world. And I've given up on some of those other types of devices and aids because I don't aspire to walk ever. It is not safe for me to be a walk-in person in this world. I don't care to do it. And so I don't know that that gets to all of your question, but it did resonate when you talked about showing up as disabled, which for me is a personal identity. It's also political identity and a point of pride, and trying to approximate able-bodiedness, which I have no interest in.
Thanks. Kim or Rod, did you want to say something about this question? Follow up what Yomi has said? Kim, please.
Okay. Yeah, just in terms of thinking about that question, for me, I'm not someone who has disability as an identity at present, but who was born disabled. And it's interesting to me in terms of conversations about disability, where folks often think about how disability is always in the future. And that, of course, is always a possibility. And yet it's also a part of my past, and it has shaped my habitual embodied way of being in the world. And how I think about myself and how I think about relations with others. So I think of myself as situated between, which is one of the things that I was trying to underscore in the in what I said. But in terms of technology, I mean, if I think about sort of the square piece of plywood that my uncle made with wheels on it, that's something that I loved throughout my childhood. It was something that enabled me to get around really quickly and to run away from people by rolling really fast, out of the reach of adults, but much faster than I would have been able to do if I crawled or something like that, which I couldn't do. But in terms of thinking about limping, swaggering, and technology that has been really important, I think shoes are incredibly important. Shoes for gendered reasons, shoes for supportive reasons, not being able to choose the shoes that I wanted, and that was a part of my gender identity as well, that was rendered invisible in that moment, which was also about disability. But for me, part of walking or navigating in the world is also about doing so in ways that defy gendered and abled expectations of embodiment.
Oh, that's great. Rod, did you want to address this particular question?
Sure, thank you. I think just one small point I'd like to make is, Rosemary, while I think it's true that all of us who understand ourselves as disabled, and all of us in a different kind of way, do use certain kinds of technology as a way to gain access to the world, as you said, Rosemary, of economics, of housing, etc. And that's extremely important. But as Yomi says, I also view my blindness as political, that kind of an identity. So technology for me is also, how do I bring blindness into the world in a way different from the typical and conventional sighted way of understanding it, as some kind of a deficit of eyesight, and merely as maybe a difference. Rather than that, I need to find ways, and I've done this all of my blind life and continue to do it, and haven't really found ways yet that I'm satisfied with, bringing blindness as a distinct way of being, bringing that into the world, and treating technology not merely as a resource to access your world, but to bring my world into your world in a way different from how you have it. Thanks.
Thank you, Rod. I always love, Rod and I have been friends for a long time. I always love the way you talk about having a blind life, my blind life. I find that very poetic. I'm an English teacher and I love poetry and literature. So it's particularly important for me to be able to be involved in and hear your stories today. So thank you. I'm going to go on to the third question, which I think actually might be the more powerful of these. So in your stories, the three of you today that you've shared with us about flourishing as people with disabilities, all three of you have used words that describe your lives and yourselves, which might be surprising words to people who don't know very many disabled people very well. Yomi spoke of having power. Rod spoke of experiencing grace and joy as a blind man. Kim spoke of her swagger, not as a defect, but as gain, in terms of gain. Can you tell us more fully about the benefits that you've experienced in your life by living with a way of being that many people, indeed, really society in general, often understands not as power, not as gain, not as joy, but as deficit or defect? Okay, hard questions.
I'll start.
Thank you, Rod.
Yeah, this is difficult because, I mean, while I think Kim is right, there is a certain kind of gain with disability. I suppose in some sense there's a kind of a gain with most ways of being in the world. I think rather than benefits or gain, one way I like to think of it often about my blindness at least is that while the world generally and typically give me some sense of blindness as clearly not something others want to be. So it's kind of living a life where you know nobody wants. And that's sometimes, depending on my mood, and during COVID times, it's not really that great. I think that that's not exactly something I like to think of, and this doesn't seem to be any possibility of gain or benefit. I think, though, in terms of not being trapped really within the conventional, taken for granted ways of understanding, for instance, the visual or sight, which is typically understood as something natural, as something that you just look and see, and that's all there is to it. Really, in some sense, eyesight is something that, as a blind person, my blindness has given me the opportunity. Now, whether I take it or not is up to me in many ways, but it's given me the opportunity to realize that your sight is the furthest thing from natural that's possible. You need to, in a sense, somehow show one another that you can see. And it's beautiful to, in quotation marks, watch from a blind point of view. Because sighted people are so busy demonstrating to one another that they can see that sometimes it's humorous and other times a little sad. Nonetheless, it is really, really interesting and a lot of fun and joy to move in the world, particularly with my late guide dog Smokey, and talk to him as I moved about seeing and sight, and pretending that he actually answered. But it's just to me kind of fascinating. One little example, that's all I have left, is kind of looking toward people when you're talking, something I can really imitate well. And it's interesting how well I can imitate seeing and sight. Sometimes when I'm sitting in a place where nobody knows me, I take it for sighted. And I just love how the perceived accuracy of sight can be that tricked. So I love tricking sight. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Yomi. Kim, did you want to comment on joy, gain, power? Complicated, as we say, in the way that Rod.
I can comment on joy, I think. I mean, it's no fun in some ways not to be anonymous, having to be stopped and having your gait commented upon by whomever one might encounter while you're just trying to go from one place to another sometimes. But at the same time, I think the joy has to do with a sense of living in ways that create new ways to be. I think that there's a navigation that's also a kind of forging of a path that is of new ways of living, of relating to others, that I found incredibly joyful as a queer person.
Yomi, did you want to get the last word, or shall we go on to the audience?
No, I'm good.
Thank you.
I'm still thinking about it, so not quite
well,
ready to take it on. But
of course you are. That's what this format will give us the opportunity to do. So Eric, why don't we and Joel move on to the audience questions, and obviously all three of us, maybe even all four of us, can participate in these questions, which I think will be very productive. So thanks. Thank you all for this part of the program.
Okay, once again, we're going to pause for an interpreter switch. Okay. I think we're ready.
Well, I'll just add my thanks to Rosemary and the wonderful speakers and turn it over to Joel Michael Reynolds.
Hello, everyone. This is Joel Reynolds speaking. I would like to encourage the people who are watching to submit their questions or comments in the Q&A. We've been watching that very carefully this entire time. We've already got a number of questions written down that we're going to look through, but whatever comes to your mind, please go ahead and submit it. We're also going to take a look at Twitter and Facebook, but the Q&A inside of Zoom is a bit easier to manage at the moment. I'd like to start with the following question. Each of the three speakers' presentations take up in different ways the problem of ableism. Now, although ableism is a concept that's increasingly discussed in international media and other sorts of public spaces, it's not as well understood as related terms like racism or sexism. Could you talk about what ableism means to you and why combating it matters? And I will use the same method that Rosemary used, so I'm just gonna rely on you raising your hand or just saying something. Whoever would like to jump in, you're more than welcome to. Yes, Kim.
Hard to know how to jump in here. So yeah, that's a really important question. Ableism, I think about as systematic and institutionalized normalization and naturalization of able-bodied mindedness, right? Of the sense that being able-bodied, having a certain appearance, way of moving through the world is something that's natural. And there's so much in, I mean, lots of folks have written about this within disability studies, like Robert McGruer. In terms of my own thinking about ableism, I'm interested in how it is that it is, it both informs and is informed by other systems of oppression. And so one of the things that Robert McGruer talks about is compulsory able-bodiedness, right? And compulsory able-mindedness, that there's an imperative to fit into these norms of embodiment and movement in the world. And I think that what's so important about that is, first of all, that no one really does. I mean, most of us, in some sense, fail to embody that norm, but also its exclusionary force is quite harmful, right? It informs all kinds of efforts to normalize the body, whether it is through, say, medical interventions, right, surgical so-called corrections, but also it informs violence that people can encounter in the world. And so I think understanding how it is that those institutionalized pressures to be normal are basically a part of what it is that informs ableism.
Rod or Yomi, would you like to jump in on this particular question?
I feel like Kim said it very succinctly.
Okay. And Rod, I think we accidentally have you muted. Oh, now you're unmuted.
Oh, yeah, I think Kim was really good at in her comments. I think also one of the things that it is kind of a systemic problem, really, which does not belong to disabled people, incidentally, or maybe not incidentally, doesn't belong to disabled people. It's related, of course, to as Eric said, and as Kim said, to racism, sexism, different, various kinds of systemic discrimination and exclusion, and it does lead, it does result often in violence. I think sometimes when people speak of the various kinds of oppression, such as sexism, ableism, racism, it's often, as I said, understood as systemic, but not me. The system is, but not me, is sometimes one of the issues. And it's interesting just in terms of disability, or in my case, blindness, how a kind of ableist perspective is a sighted community acting as though, speaking as though, thinking as though they understand blindness in some kind of a complete way. First, that it's an absence of sight, i.e. an absence of who they are. And B, that the person living that absence would rather have what they have. And so there's that kind of sense of you'd rather be me, but unfortunately you're not. And then there's that ableist version of gain, which is one of the difficulties I have with that concept, that we have somehow or other naturally compensated for our loss, in my case, loss of sight, so that I hear better, smell better, etc. I don't mean smell better, you know what I mean, and that sort of thing. And even some comments begin with that. Like often in a group, people might say things like, Rod, you'll appreciate this having better hearing. And inevitably I'll say, pardon, and often they'll get it, often they won't. So this also, that's sort of an ableist stuff that is informed by, to use Kim's terms, and informs the more systemic ableist oppression. Thanks, Joe, for the opportunity.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And one of the things that I hear in both of your comments is the way in which one effect of ableism is to create what you could call ableist common sense, right? The idea that, of course, I would want to be able to see and not be blind. Why would, this kind of fundamental default assumption that it is easy for able-bodied people to have, that being able-bodied in X, Y, or Z ways is certainly better, is certainly desired, is certainly, and this is, I think, this ties back very directly with Kim's citation of Robert McRue's notion of compulsory able-bodiedness, this kind of an imperative, I think was the word you used, Kim, an almost command that operates often at, not even necessarily at a reflective level, but operates at the background of people's assumptions about the world and how it should be. All right, I'm talking too much. Let me ask another question. So, and I'm sorry if it looks like I'm not paying attention to people. I'm trying to track the questions and compile them and also listen. So my apologies for the multitasking. Here's a question that I think is very much worth talking about that comes from the audience. How do you think that the medical field should change in order to have a better response to and relationship with people with disabilities and disability communities? And the person who wrote this then further specified, how do you think that your specific interaction with it could have been better? And of course, if you want to speak to the more general claim or specific, that's entirely up to you.
I'll go first. I think, and I work in healthcare, and so I have the opportunity to see the field sort of from another view, working in healthcare, but also being a subject and participant my whole life in the medical model. And for me, I would say that when it comes to disability or impairment, I think that if just, sort of globally talking about the medical field, and if we're talking about children, that we need to be preparing people and addressing function. Like, it would have been much better to prepare me to be an adult and function in the world as it is, rather than try to fix me to try to make these minor inroads in an ableist society. Like, ableism exists, the world is not built on a scale for me, and how can we maximize function and independence and autonomy and agency? And so rather than looking at fixing my bones, straightening my legs, which some of that I think was beneficial, because some of the surgeries that I had and some of the interventions actually allowed me to thrive from a physical standpoint in certain ways. But so much energy and I feel just wasted time and money on really trying to get me to fit into and blend into an ableist world. And I just feel like, for me and for so many people I know, it's really about function. And how can I live on my own terms? How can I make decisions about my care and my well-being? What does it mean to me to thrive? Not what does it mean to my doctor or the social worker or any of these other people who are going to be looking at it through an ableist lens. What does this mean to me to flourish? And then let's get there together and let's have a care partnership that allows that to happen. So I see that that's needed, and I think that that's the direction that a lot of the medical field as respects addressing the issue of disability should go.
Yeah, Kim.
Yeah, that's great and important. Just to add something from my experience too, is that not to assume as we think about flourishing on one's own terms, as one thinks about what that means, not to assume heterosexuality, not to assume gender conformity, because so much of, the notion of what it means to walk is also about a style of walking. What it means to have a normal walk isn't just sort of, moving somewhere, putting one foot in front of the other, but also doing so in a certain way in terms of one's body comportment. And the two are fused in my experience of having my walk commented upon, and so I think, flourishing has to be that we don't separate out also disability from gender, from sexuality, that we think of people as whole beings and allow for diverse modes of flourishing. And also that, at least I was an infant, so I know this is a story told to me, but my parents weren't upset. They were upset that I might not ever walk. And I think there's a lot that could be done to make it so that people who are making decisions have access to communities and people who can communicate that it's possible to flourish in all kinds of ways of being in the world. I think that would be important too.
Yeah, Rod.
I have one quick comment. Kim and Yomi, I think addressed it beautifully. But it seems to me, in my experience with the medical community, and as others have told me about their experience, other disabled people in the medical community, the medical community is it seems to me, individual practitioners are committed to something that Rosemary talked about way back in 1997, kind of a normate version of the body, the mind, of the senses, etc. And they come to us. They come to their interaction with us generally, typically with that notion of the normate, and that we would, as Kim and Yomi said, like to be anyone other than who we are. And there is that assumption. There is that assumption, you know, as Kim said, about our sexuality, our gender notions, etc. So this medicine sometimes appears to me, or comes to me, as kind of like the quintessential protector of the normate. And it's as if somehow I'm an enemy that invaded that, you know. And I remember one thing in particular to ophthalmology, which I've seen a ton of these people. Other than one, I would love at least a little bit of sense of humor from her. I remember once when I was in graduate school in the University of British Columbia, I had my eyes, something was up. So the ophthalmologist looked in my eyes with one of those ophthalmoscopes, like really close, that kind of thing. And then I remember he, except for one ophthalmologist, they were all he's for me, pushed away and said, "It's really messy in there." And I said, "You should see it from this side." And like, not a word. Not a word. So there's got to be a bit more, I guess I'm saying a bit more humanness, a bit more like letting go a little bit of that normate, letting go of some of the assumptions about what the human in some kind of a moral sense ought to be, should be.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And that this actually opens quite naturally onto another question we've got that
Joel, I'm just going to stop you for a second, since we do need to give the interpreters a chance to switch. Also, right before that, one quick note. This is the 90-minute mark of the event, but there are about 500 people in the audience. We're getting a ton of questions. And so we're planning to stay here until 5. You're all welcome to stay with us, and we hope many of you will. So again, thank you for all of your patience. Okay, go ahead and switch. Okay.
Another question would be about each of your talks were in relationship to technologies of multiple sorts, technological interventions, technological objects you use, etc. And one thing that especially stuck out to an audience member was about Rod's talk, referring to, you know, we don't typically think about dogs as a technology, and yet it's also very natural to see why Smokey, you know, fits into this conversation and serves an instrumental function in your life, but also is much more than merely a technology, or, you know, you see where the question is going. And so I'm wondering if you all might, and maybe Rod, you can start, especially in relationship to thinking about Smokey, but if you could all talk a bit more about what the concept of technology means to you and how you think about the relationship between your particular way of being disabled and particular way of being in the world and these objects and practices we refer to as technologies.
Sure, Joel, thanks. And thanks for the question. I think first thing I'd like to say is that, you know, my blindness and I think just disability in general emerges or becomes a sort of entity or phenomenon because of the way we relate to it. So if I relate to my blindness as a technical issue requiring technical intervention and solutions, then that's what my blindness is. It's a technical problem or a technical thing. And of course, all of us, whether we're disabled or not, can see ourselves in that way. You know, we could see eating food as a technical matter, you know, and most of the world doesn't have that ability to even define food to eat or have food to eat. You know, so but eating and other kinds of things are far more than merely technical, even though we all have to use techniques, but they tend to overpower sometimes who we are. And they tend, I think, to overpower a disability identity. Because one of the things I think that non-disabled people kind of harbor a notion of like, how can they do that stuff that I do? You know, how can a blind person read? You know, how can a wheelchair person, you know, get into that building with those stairs, etc. This is all these notions of how we're going to do this stuff that you can get to cite Rosemary, that normates normally do. And that's a fair question. I think Smokey, for instance, of course, was a piece of technology insofar as he and I had an instrumental relation. I relied on him to get around, but more than get around. I mean, my life was in his hand, really, you know, in some sense. But what Smokey did more than that was, first of all, he loved to, what the trainers call, work. He loved to work. He loved to guide. And when he heard the harness, he just was jumping. He just wanted to work. He wanted to go and work. He just wanted that. And that gave me that sense of joy I was speaking of. My blindness was giving Smoke a chance to do something he loved to do. And it was evident to me. So my blindness became, for me, that little bit of a source of joy, not only for him, but for me. And it was more the kind of blindness that Smokey allowed me to release into the world. I didn't any longer have that sense of, oh, here's a drag. Now I got to get from here to there. And how the hell am I going to do it? You know, and stay safe and know where the heck I am when I get there, you know? So I enjoyed the trip. Thanks.
Kim or Yomi, are you interested in responding to this question? Yeah, Kim?
And it's a great question. It's very thought-provoking. What Rod said was really amazing. But you know, just to add, I think often we think of technology as something that we use or is applied to bodies in order to make it so that bodies can move through conventional kinds of spaces, right? But I think for me, as I think about an experience, well, there are all kinds of technologies, I think, in my experience as well. But if I think about the one example of surgery, I think that embracing and so on, there are also effects that aren't anticipated in terms of interaction with surgery, or with technologies. And so in those spaces that are opened up, I think there's a different possibility of being, that it's not necessarily that it's just applying technology to a body in some way or using it in some way, but that it also makes something else that wasn't anticipated possible, that also calls into question that more normalizing mode of thinking about technology. And that's what I think is really powerful in terms of having a critical disability critique of technology and what that means.
Yomi, did you want to jump in here, or you want to wait for the next question? So this leads us in some ways back to this concept of crip game that Kim, you talked about. This also came up in well, it really was at play in each of the talks. And we got multiple questions from the audience about this idea. Some people seemed a bit skeptical, some seemed confused, some loved it, you know, all over the kind of board. And so I'd like to return us to this concept and maybe tease out in a little more detail what what this idea of crip gain means, and maybe even kind of pros and cons of it. It seems if you add all the three talks together, there's something about that concept that gets things right, but something about it that maybe is problematic. And ideally, if we can do this in a way that ties back, right, to the whole theme of not simply this event, but the series as a whole, which is the relationship between disability, technology, and flourishing. This idea that one is living the sort of life that one actually wants to and is able to carry out that sort of life relative to how we find ourselves in the world and how society is structured. I think I explained that in a far more complicated and less elegant manner than Eric did earlier. My apologies. What he said. Anyway, crip game. Does someone want to take a first jump at talking about this? Yeah, Yum.
I would love to hear Kim just say a little bit more about it, and then I would like to jump on that. But I'd like to hear Kim just talk more about it, because I love to hear Kim talk about this.
I don't know. When I wrote it, I thought maybe not, maybe. That's what I sort of said. Maybe one would call this something like a crip game. So I have my own questions about that term. I'm not necessarily comfortable with it. But what I was trying to say, I wasn't trying to say something like, oh, let's look at all the positive things, or something like this. I was more trying to think about flourishing, using it, sort of another word for flourishing, how it is that defying, normalization, existing between ability and disability, or that this isn't a scene of loss, that this is a scene also of flourishing. And so how to talk about that in ways that rework a kind of ableist distinction between disability and ability. So it's not necessarily the sense of gaining a new skill or something like that, but creating possibilities for flourishing is more what I have in mind. And so perhaps it's not the best phrase. I'd be very open and willing to learn from others about that too.
Oh no, I'm going to use that now. From today going forward, we will be talking about crip gain, just like in disability justice spaces where we talk about abolition and resilience and resistance and freedom and joy and flourishing and all of that goes with it. I really like the concept, so you've given me something today, and I'm just going to keep thinking about it. And I think for me, it goes back to, I mentioned something earlier about the protective quality of my wheelchair, but I also feel like, I have experienced things in this life that I absolutely would not have experienced had I not been born with a disability or acquired a disability or anything. I would not be in this conversation. But for my specific crip experience. There are, millions of other middle-aged Black women who I share very similar, universal experiences with, and they're not invited into these conversations because what is interesting about me, or perhaps different, or what differentiates me or sets me apart, is the way that I move through the world, is this positioning of me as outside the normal way of things, right? So I see that as a gain. And I just like this concept of all of the ways that my disability has provided entree into spaces and experiences that I wouldn't otherwise have. But it is also, I see my experience as who I am, as Yomi, as deeply spiritual. I feel like it is an exercise in spirituality that I am on. I'm working out a lot of things in this lifetime, on this plane, at this moment, right now. And so I feel like this is the body I was meant to have. This is the experience that I was meant to have. And so I really view, I like this concept of crypt gain, because when I review sort of all of the things that I've been to and through and the things that I get to experience, and the way my mind and my heart has been really sharpened and smoothed over and over and over again by these experiences that I have, I see that as gain. I see that as something that I've been endowed with and blessed with.
Yeah, Rod?
Yeah, that's beautiful, Yomi. I sort of have some of Kim's, some of Yomi's understanding and feel about gain. I think what's interesting to me is that the gain, if such there is, that I get from blindness is not the gain that people usually think. It's not that I gained better hearing or better touch or anything like that, but the gain I got, I think, was to understand that being on the margins of life, as Yomi kind of hinted at, is, as Bell Hooks used to say, not such a bad thing. That's just not too bad of a position to be in. You can see a lot of stuff from the margins that you just can't see from the center. Just keep using that metaphor. And as Yomi says, I wouldn't be right here at all were it not for my blindness and for not who I am in that sense, as blindness being part of who I am and not what I am. It's not something that attached itself to me as something, it's me in a part of who I am. I think also it's given me a sense to have a look at the center that I think being smack dab in the middle of it doesn't really give you. It's kind of like that old fashioned thing people used to say, a fish has no idea it's in water, tell us out, that kind of thing. So it gave me a chance to ask a question and revisit a question that my partner and colleague, disability studies colleague, Tanya Tichkowski once asked. And that is, once we are disabled, refers to disabled people, once we're in, what are we in for? So to kind of question the center's kind of almost visceral need to include us. And now inclusion has become not just an act, it's become a thing, right? And it's amazing how badly they want us in. And I was speaking with another blind scholar named Devin Healy yesterday, and we were speaking about inclusion. To get in is one thing, to stay in is another. It's almost as if we were saying that once we're included, we're told that if you want to stick around, you got to bring your own glue. So it has given me a chance to take a look at that stuff as well. And that's I think, is some version of a gain. Plus, I love what Yomi said and what Kim said.
Yeah, Yomi.
Thinking more about gains. So, there's sort of this fan fiction about people with my particular disability, osteogenesis imperfecta, that we have like these super brains, right? That a lot of people with OI are super intelligent, very articulate, blah, blah, great communicators, all of that. And, of course, I was told this my whole life growing up, like, hey, this is a positive. And that's fine. And I believed it was true because I was reading at a very, very young age. I think I had started memorizing books at 2. I could recite them back. I started reading very early. I was very conversant. I was a good communicator and I was clear. And I met a lot of other children with OI who were the same way. it just seemed like we all just had these super brains, that was something that we gained as having part of this congenital disability. Later on, my orthopedic specialist at Stanford, Dr. James Gamble, we were talking about this. And every time he would see somebody with OI, he'd say, "What do you do? You know, where did you go to school? What is your job?" Now, he would sort of want to know where people ended up in life and what their trajectory was, and did this like smart gene carry through all of us. And he told me something that I thought was fascinating and that I believe is true. It is not that we have super brains. It is that because our bodies were so physically fragile. I mean, I was born with several broken bones. It is not unusual for people with my disability to break hundreds of bones in their lifetime. Because of always being in peril physically, we had to develop language early in order to communicate danger, pain, fear, how to handle us, how to touch us, move me this way, please don't move me that way. And so it is an adaptation that I believe probably carries through a lot of other disabilities where people have developed early verbal skills and reasoning and ability. I see that as a crip gain. And it's not just because we all just have these big brains, we were just given these, I think really it's an adaptation of needing to be able to somehow communicate to anybody who was touching us or handling us the right way to do it so that we did not get repeatedly injured. So I see that as a gain. Before
I ask another question and or comment on this one, because we are getting near the end of time, we've got about 11 minutes left, I want to give an opportunity for each of you to add something that maybe you wanted to say earlier during the Q&A or came up at any point. I want to make sure you have an opportunity to throw something else in the ring, as it were, before time runs out.
I have to just say, I'm not mad at my siblings. The very few people who've heard this story, they're like, how could they do that to you? I hold no animosity or ill feelings toward anybody involved in that movie incident. I get it. Everybody was doing their best. And I just need to say that in case any of my family members ever get a hold of this recording and feel like I've thrown them under the bus.
Duly noted.
Yes, I mean, also, I mean, I was very much loved and cared for. I think people do their best. And so it doesn't mean there aren't effects and that aren't intended. But yes, I mean, I don't blame my parents or anybody for things that I experienced.
Yeah, I feel the same as Yomi and Kim. I think I think when I was saying the joy and the gain and of blindness, I wasn't suggesting that the sighted world, as I'm calling it, or many other people call it, is exactly the most joyful and pleasurable place to live if you're blind. There's a lot of assumptions about blind people that are not too happy to live with. I think another thing I wanted to say is I do have some people I'm extremely grateful to. Was my partner Tanya and the students I've had, two artists, writers, one blind, one not. Lynn Manning, who some of you I'm sure have heard of, the late Lynn Manning, and the late Austin Clarke, who's a Canadian Caribbean writer of novels. And I spent lots of time with both these people. They were both great friends. And about 8 or 9 years ago, Austin was an award-winning novelist, and poet and short story writer, said one evening to me at his place, "You're going to have to bring blindness out in fiction, my friend." And so I started writing fiction with his tutelage, and I'm continuing to do that. So that's one thing I wanted to say, is that the experience of being blind in the world, where it appears, it seems like it's kind of a marginal way of being, has given me a lot of opportunity to do a lot of things.
Thank you for that, Rod, and thanks to each of you. I am having trouble figuring out how we should end this. I think it's just because I don't want this to end. This has been such a fantastic set of talks and such a fantastic conversation. Oh boy. Yeah, I'm looking, there's a lot of good questions left. The audience has been really active and fantastic. How about this? A number of people asked about the relationship between gender and disability. And also there were a number of questions about race and ethnicity more specifically. And it seemed like a number of audience members were eager to hear your thoughts about how to think these things together, or perhaps how to think about them separately, but keep the focus on disability, and what it means to kind of, what does a truly intersectional kind of understanding of disability look like? That might be one way to kind of phrase a set of questions that arose from the audience. That's a tall order of a question, but
well, I'm gonna interrupt a second.
Yes.
And just let the interpreter switch.
All right, so think about that while we do that.
Okay.
Would someone like to go first? Yeah, Kim.
Go first. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in terms of gender and disability, let's just start there, but also to think more broadly also about class and race, disability, along with gender and sexuality. I mean, in my own experience, when we think about what body norms are, what are the norms of embodiment? They're always already gendered. There's a way to move. There's a way to be embodied, gesture, or whatever it is, and that those are always gendered modes. And disability places one outside of those gender norms as well, right? As does being gender nonconforming, being queer. All of that places one outside of what's expected in terms of the body that one has. We expect a certain kind of gender conformity, heterosexuality, but the performance of that in one's navigation of the world is also a performance of ability. And I think that's why it is that Robert McGruer talks about compulsory able-bodiedness and compulsory heterosexuality, how it is that they rely on each other. Their normalization and naturalization kind of depend upon each other. And I certainly, in terms of thinking about walking, that's one way in which they come together in terms of how I move, how I navigate the world, but also how my body is responded to, how my modes of navigation are responded to, whether it be by a stare or a comment. One is always aware that you're not quite what people expect you to be in some way. And I think it's really important to think about those. I mean, I didn't talk about race or class, but certainly when thinking about, you know, access to technologies and class, how important that is. and also thinking about race and how it is that there are ways in which, you know, in a white supremacist context, as a white person, I have more fluid movement in the world. So we're always sort of in those spaces between being able to kind of move through the world in an unobstructed way and then being perceived as not quite belonging in it. And that environment has to be navigated as well. It's part of what is navigated.
That's wonderful, Kim, and it brings me back to this theme that I heard in each of the talks of the kind of betweenness, the not necessarily being on one side or the other of some particular phenomenon or norm or expectation, or even how one relates to oneself, and that one of the aspects of many sorts of disability experience involves feeling either at the, we could use the margins and center metaphor that Rod used earlier, or we could use this kind of inside outside metaphor. Yeah, very powerful. Thank you, Kim.
So I think for me, the way that I think about all of this and apply certain practices is just by being a student of and learning more and more how to deeply embody a disability justice framework, which is intersectional, which centers the most impacted, which really picks up where the disability rights movement kind of left off, where we are actually explicitly naming racism, sexism, gender violence, all of these things as identities and experiences that we shouldn't have to rank or check at the door in order to have rights or in order to be free. There are 10 principles of disability justice to that framework that I think are just really illuminate some of what you and Kim were just talking about. And it's sort of where my political heart and home are these days, and really understanding my place in the world and where I see the work being. Like the work is toward liberation. The work is anti-capitalist. It is abolitionist. It is to tear down white supremacy and sexism and ableism and all of its forms. And that work is led by people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. It's led by queer people. It's led by folks who are neurodiverse. It is led by people who have not been your standard bearers of the disability rights movement.
That might be the most perfect place to end. We are actually at time, and I just want to add just one thing to what you said, Yummy, so wonderfully, is when we talked about ableism earlier, I should have said that I think the best understanding of that term that I've ever encountered is from T.L. Lewis, and they worked with also Dustin Gibson and a collective of people to come up with an understanding of ableism that takes settler colonialism seriously, capitalism seriously. It's really, I think, a kind of genius understanding of the term. So for those who are interested in thinking more about that, I'd highly recommend T.L. Lewis's work, Dustin Gibson's work, etc. Each of them are very involved in disability justice activism, etc.
Yeah, those are our luminary thinkers.
Yeah.
Stacey Milburn, Patty Byrne, Leroy Moore, Mia Mingus. These are the people who gave us this gift of this disability justice framework. And then we have so many others, as you've named, who are carrying that work forward. And they are the guiding lights for us and for me.
Yes. And each of you are guiding lights also. I am so pleased that we got to have this time together. I don't actually know what happens right now, but I believe that Liz will appear, or maybe we will hear from Liz about what occurs at this juncture.
Yeah, we are going to wrap things up. I think Eric might have a few closing comments. But just before that, I want to say, we had a couple of questions about the Q&A. Since there are hundreds of you, we unfortunately were not able to get to all the questions, but we hope that you will continue this conversation on Twitter and Facebook, and we would love to keep hearing from you after this. So Eric, did you have any final comments?
Liz, my video is not activated, which is just fine, because all I want to say is thank you so much to all of the people who made this terrific event possible. And that, of course, includes all of the people in the audience. Thank you all so much. This is a wonderful event, wonderful way to celebrate the center's 50th. I hope we will see all of you at our next event. Keep a lookout for the ad for that third event. Be safe, stay well. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and stay well.